people are blaming Biden for the inflation because of a big amount of federal spending during the pandemic. When he entered office in 2021, the country was still very much dealing with the fallout from the COVID pandemic.
Right.
And one of his first legislative acts, or Democrats in Congress and him with his support, was passing a massive package of spending, COVID spending, and a lot of Republicans have said that played a huge role in building up the inflation and why it's taking so long to kind of chisel away at it. So there's just so much extra money out there, and so heading into the election year, you're going to see Republicans really using that inflation as like an attack against Biden.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by economics reporter Zach Halaschak. Zach, we've got some big inflation news this week, and things are running a little hot. Talk a little bit about what the data says.
Yeah, some big inflation news and not good inflation news. I think that's the key point, is that inflation actually ticked back up again to 3.5% in the consumer price index, which is, I guess you'd say, the most closely watched gauge of inflation.
Sure.
And that's certainly bad news because interest rates have been at the high level they're at now since July. So the Fed has been waiting to see downward progress on inflation with the hopes of cutting at some point this year. But this report kind of surprised economists. Economists thought it would still be a little bit warm, if you will, but it came in even hotter than expected. So now investors are starting to think that the rate cuts aren't even going to come in the first half of this year now, and they're kind of expecting maybe a cut, maybe two cuts in the second half of the year, perhaps at the September meeting. But all that's going to really depend on the trajectory of inflation going down the line.
So obviously this affects interest rates, also affects potentially President Biden's reelection prospects. What are people saying about why this inflation's been so persistent?
Yeah, so there's several reasons, but the main one is maybe one, that rates haven't been high enough or restricted enough for longer. People are blaming Biden for the inflation because of a big amount of federal spending during the pandemic. When he entered office in 2021, the country was still very much dealing with the fallout from the COVID pandemic.
Right.
And one of his first legislative acts, or Democrats in Congress and him with his support, was passing a massive package of spending, COVID spending, and a lot of Republicans have said that played a huge role in building up the inflation and why it's taking so long to kind of chisel away at it. So there's just so much extra money out there, and so heading into the election year, you're going to see Republicans really using that inflation as like an attack against Biden, and people are feeling it at grocery stores and auto dealerships when they go to buy things. It's so much higher now than it was just a few years ago, and Republicans are going to try to draw that contrast to when President Trump was in office and use that hope in their goal of getting back the White House.
So not only is the White House in play this year, but so is control of the Senate, and one of the states that may decide which party is in the majority is Pennsylvania. And you've talked to the Republican candidate in this race about his plans for dealing with the administrative state and size of government. What are some of the things you learned?
Yeah, I had an interesting interview with David McCormick this week, the former CEO of Bridgewater Associates, major hedge fund, who attempted to run for Senate in 2022 in the Republican primary against Dr. Mehmet Oz, ended up losing in a very, very close primary. I think it was less than 1,000 votes to Dr. Oz, who then went on to lose to John Fetterman, the Democrat, in the general election. But in talking to McCormick, one of his big goals, and what he kind of kept harkening back to, was that Pennsylvanians are really feeling the effects of federal regulations, be they environmental regulations, housing, all sorts of regulations. He's saying that he wants to go to D.C. and strike to do something to pare that back. This is kind of a common refrain in recent years from Republicans, who are kind of upset that the administrative state under President Biden has been so active and there's been so many rules and changes. And so that's become a kind of a common refrain in Congress, is there needs to be some sort of congressional oversight over rulemaking, whether it's Congress voting up or down on different rules that have large economic impacts, or sunsetting rules after a set amount of time. So a major goal of McCormick's going into the Senate, should he win, would be paring back that administrative state.
Where is McCormick on trade policy?
Yeah, so he's kind of more in the traditional vein of the Republican Party. There's been a sort of split among Republicans in recent years, especially since the time of Trump, to more Trumpist populism, kind of trade barriers, tariffs. Former President Trump even pitched 10% across the board tariffs. But McCormick kind of is not a fan of tariffs. He told me that. But he does think there should be some in certain instances like China, where there's imbalances between trade in two countries. So he thinks it's a tool that can be used, but one that I believe that he wants to avoid as much as possible.
Thank you, Zach. You can read Zach and the rest of our policy team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.